Hi, my name is Chris Rodriguez. I'm the director of the ABLE National Resource Center. I'd like to welcome everybody to the third week of our hashtag #AbleToSave National Public Awareness Campaign. This week we've started to focus on just exactly what ABLE dollars or funds contributed into an ABLE account can be used for. And that is the purpose of this week's webinar, quote, Understanding Qualified Disability-Related Expenses. This webinar is brought to you by the ABLE National Resource Center and sponsored by our friends at TIAA-CREF. We appreciate their support and their relevance in the ABLE space, and we support their efforts. Okay, so a little housekeeping. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure that your speakers are turned on or that your headphones are plugged in. If you can control the audio broadcast via the audio broadcast panel. If you accidentally close the panel, you can reopen it by going to the quote communicate menu at the bottom at the top of your screen and choosing quote join audio broadcast. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or would simply prefer to listen by phone, the dial-in information is on the right-hand corner of your screen. It also should be in your webinar registration confirmation email as well. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. The captions can be found in the Media Viewer panel, which appears in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar platform. If you want to make the Media Viewer panel larger, you can minimize other panels such as chat, Q&A, and/or the participants panel. Please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct those questions accordingly during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you are listening by phone if you're listening by phone and not logged into the webinar, you may ask questions by emailing KAUCHENBACH@ndi-inc.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the ABLE National Resource Center website at the following web address. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send a message to the host NDI-admin, or you may also email KAUCHENBACH@ndi-inc.org. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. I just want to do a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to give a brief explanation about our ABLE National Resource Center. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the purpose of our hashtag #AbleToSave month-long public awareness campaign. We're then going to cover just a few of the ABLE basics so that we all have a basic understanding and foundation from which to understand the content for today's webinar. And then we're going to go ahead and launch into the kind of main event, which is talking more about and helping folks better understand what exactly are qualified disability expenses. After we do that, we're going to give some examples, and then hopefully at the end, we're going to have plenty of time for some questions and answers. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So just a little information about our ABLE National Resource Center. We are a collaborative whose supporters share the goal of accelerating the design and availability of ABLE accounts for the benefits of individuals with disabilities and their families. We bring together the investment, support, and resources of the country's largest and most influential national disability organizations. And as always, we encourage folks to visit our website, which can be found at www.ablenrc.org. We have a wealth of information on that website, including informational videos, personal testimonies from ABLE account owners, We have a comparison tool that you can compare one ABLE program to another. We have each individual state's progress in terms of if they have launched a program or if they're in the progress of launching a program. Again, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, all of our webinars that are done through the center are archived on the website. In addition to that, on the front page there's an opportunity to sign up for our Achievable newsletter, which goes out monthly and highlights different things that are happening in the ABLE space. So again, I encourage everybody to visit that website. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our hashtag #AbleToSave campaign. The hashtag #AbleToSave campaign is a month-long marketing and informational campaign which takes place throughout the entire month of August. This national campaign is spearheaded by the ABLE National Resource Center in collaboration with the Center's 25+ national disability organizational members, state ABLE programs, financial institutions, and other ABLE-related stakeholders. The hashtag #AbleToSave campaign strives to blanket the entire country with widespread information concerning all things related to ABLE, with the aim to significantly accelerate the opening of ABLE accounts by eligible individuals with disabilities and their families. And this is actually the second year in which we've done this campaign. Again, the primary goal of the campaign is to increase awareness and education about ABLE accounts, and again, to help accelerate the opening of ABLE accounts nationwide, both in the short and in the long term. Many of you know that the first ABLE program was launched just over 2 years ago, and since then, I think the latest numbers indicate that there are over 25,000 individuals with disabilities who have opened up these incredible new savings accounts to help them save for their futures, which is absolutely incredible. But we also know that there are millions of people across the United States that are eligible to open up these accounts and to take advantage of the transformative opportunity that's associated with being an ABLE account owner. So there's certainly, while we're really, really proud of the work that's been done and all the education and outreach, we also know that campaigns like this one still have a strong role to play with respect to getting even more people signed up for ABLE accounts and on the road to building a better, more sound financial future for themselves. So just a little more about the outline of the campaign. The campaign again takes place throughout the entire month of August and is actually broken down into 4 individual weeks of education, information, and marketing, of which we're on the 3rd week. Each week focuses on a different aspect of ABLE with the aim of providing potential ABLE account owners and their families with comprehensive education and motivation to feel comfortable enrolling in an ABLE program of their choice. The first week of the campaign, we kicked off with the kind of umbrella topic of the basic overview of ABLE. We wanted to give folks just kind of a basic understanding of the history of ABLE, the ABLE Act, a little bit about what ABLE programs look like in general, so that we could have a really productive conversation over the course of the entire month. Last week we discussed very specifically the eligibility criteria that one would need to satisfy in order to be allowed to open up an ABLE account. Again, ABLE accounts are for people with disabilities, but unfortunately not all people with disabilities. There are criteria that must be satisfied in order to be allowed to open up an ABLE account, and we talked about that last week. This week I'm excited to talk about basically what the funds that are contributed into and held in an ABLE account can be used for. The technical name for that are qualified disability expenses, or sometimes referred to as QDEs, and this week we're talking all about what those look like, what requirements are around those, and certainly that's going to be the topic of our webinar today. And then next week, the week that I'm personally most excited about is titled Enrollment and Beyond. And during the entirety of next week, we'll be talking about what it actually looks like to enroll in an ABLE program, what types of documentation you might need to have, where to look, how the enrollment process moves forward, how to compare one ABLE program to another. There's over 40 ABLE programs across the country, many of which do not have a residency requirement, meaning that no matter where you live, depending on your particular needs and provided that you meet those eligibility criteria that we discussed last week, you have your choice of several different programs. And it's important to know what characteristics to look for in order to figure out which program best meets your needs. And we're going to talk about that next week. In addition to that, we're also going to talk about the unveiling of some new tools on the ABLE National Resource Center website that are aimed at helping current ABLE account owners really maximize the benefits of being an ABLE account owner. Those include things related to helping people manage their ABLE accounts, tools to help people create what we call a circle of support, or basically expanding the number of people to contribute into their ABLE accounts, and then how to, kind of celebrate your independence is what we're calling it, or just basically helping other people appreciate your experience within the ABLE family and encouraging others to be a part of this great thing as well. So those are our 4 topics that we're covering. Again, the campaign is national in scale, and we utilize a diverse set of different tools in order to maximize our reach. These tools include, but are not limited to, social media, national webinars such as this one, short videos that we've created, Twitter chats, virtual town halls, certainly email blasts, and then, of course, utilization of our website. So I encourage you, again, to go to the website, sign up for our email list, certainly follow us on Twitter and Facebook as well, and keep an eye out for all these other great tools that we provide to help people feel comfortable enrolling in ABLE accounts and soon comfortable with managing those accounts as well. Okay, so before we dive into kind of the main piece of content, we're going to talk a little bit about ABLE basics. This will just be a couple slides so that everybody has kind of a basic understanding or a foundation from which to build on when we go into our specific topic of qualified disability-related expenses. Okay, so what is ABLE, right? So ABLE is the Stephen Beck Jr. Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, or ABLE Act. And what it does is it amends the federal tax code to add Section 529A in order to do the following. It creates a new option for eligible people with disabilities to save money in a tax-exempt savings or investment account, and the funds of which are in that account are to be used for qualified disability-related expenses. And what's really, really special about these accounts is the fact that the funds contributed into these accounts, of which can be in the tens of thousands of dollars, if not the hundreds of thousands of dollars, are not taken into consideration when determining the beneficiary or the person with the disability's eligibility for federally funded public benefits, including things like Medicaid, right? So many times we often scratch our head and wonder why are people with disabilities disproportionately living in poverty when compared to their typically abled peers? Well, there are several reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that people with disabilities, especially those with severe disabilities, often have special health care needs. And oftentimes these special health care needs can only be addressed through supports and services provided through Medicaid. You can't get these supports and services through your employer-based insurance. You can't get it through the insurance plans that are provided on the open market. You can really only get these supports and services through the Medicaid program. So that's what really makes the Medicaid program so vitally important to people with disabilities. But at the same time, there are certain eligibility criteria related to Medicaid and other public benefits that provide services to people with disabilities. And one of those often is an asset limit. And these asset limits oftentimes do not allow beneficiaries of those programs or people with disabilities that happen to be in Medicaid to have more than $2,000 worth of assets at any given time. So basically, as a result of some of these provisions, they've shackled people with disabilities to a life of poverty. Well, that's obviously an issue, especially when you take into consideration that people with disabilities oftentimes have significant financial challenges that is a result of their disability. So that's where ABLE comes in. excuse me, and allows people with disabilities to enroll in an ABLE program and to save significant amounts of money, well over $2,000, while at the same time not having to give up their supports and services provided through these different public benefits that do help them live independently, but at the same time have fairly severe asset limits in addition to other limitations. So that's kind of what makes ABLE so incredibly special, and that's why we're so excited, and that's why we put so much time and effort into getting information and education out there to people with disabilities about this really exciting, relatively new financial tool. So let's talk about some kind of basic characteristics of ABLE, and we'll go through this pretty quickly, and then we're going to start to dive into our main topic. But it's important to note that, again, like I said previously, there are, unfortunately, eligibility requirements related to opening an ABLE account that speak, number one, to the age in which the individual first experienced his or her disability, and two, to the severity of that disability. So not all individuals with disabilities are allowed to have an ABLE account, and it's important to know whether or not you satisfy this kind of two-pronged situation of eligibility. And I encourage folks, if you want to know more about that, go to the ABLE National Resource Center. We have short videos on it. We have an entire webinar about it and all sorts of other things to help you better understand that particular segment of ABLE. Additionally, an eligible individual is not obligated to enroll in their state of residence, right? So that's important to note, because while we're excited that there are so many ABLE programs out there, there are some states that for whatever reason have decided not to launch an ABLE program, or perhaps are in the process of launching an ABLE program. And that does not mean that the residents in their state cannot today, provided that they meet those eligibility requirements, enroll in an ABLE program and start to save for their futures without losing their benefits. Kind of on the same note, and in order to better understand this, the federal law, the ABLE Act, allows states to build and maintain these programs. It does not mandate them to do so. So a state has to choose on their own, through their own state legislature, whether or not they think, whether or not they have the resources and whether or not they're going to launch these programs. And within the first, I believe, about 12 months of the federal law passing, over 40 states had passed these ABLE-related pieces of legislation, allowing their state to launch programs. So I think that's a testament of how important the benefits of ABLE are for people with disabilities. Additionally, the designated beneficiary, which is the person with a disability, is the account owner. And this is really important to understand, and this is one of the differentiating factors between, of which there are several, differentiating factors between an ABLE account and perhaps a special needs trust, right? They both allow a significant amount of money to be saved for the benefit of a person with a disability without losing benefits. But what the ABLE Act allows for is for that person with a disability to have a lot more autonomy and a lot more independence over the funds in that account. And we think that's a really great thing to allow people with disabilities who are now getting employment and are now in, to a certain extent, inclusive education settings and what have you, the chance to oversee their own funds and exercise that level of independence that all too often many of their typically able peers take for granted. That being said, if the designated beneficiary either doesn't have the capacity to oversee their own account, or if they just choose to want some help with that, there are three types of individuals that can have what's called signature authority. And that basically means that they're allowed to exercise authority over the account on behalf of the person with a disability. But in order to be allowed to have that type of authority, you have to be one of these three types of individuals. One, if the beneficiary is a minor, then you have to be the parent. Two, if the individual is an adult, you have to be the guardian. Or three, the designated beneficiary or the person with a disability has to give you power of attorney. If you're not one of those three, then you cannot have signature authority and you cannot oversee the account on behalf of the designated beneficiary. And just to address one question, because I know we get it a lot, people often ask, what about a rep payee? If you don't know what a rep payee is, don't worry about this, but I'll just say it real quickly. Again, even if you are a rep payee on behalf of a person with a disability, if you are not one of those three, if you do not have power of attorney, if you're not the guardian, if you're not the parent, if the person's a minor, you are not allowed to have signature authority over the account. So being a rep payee in and of itself does not give you that authority. So I know that's a common question. Funds in the account can be used for, quote, qualified disability-related expenses. That's the topic of today's webinar. We're going to dig into what exactly does that term mean, and we have a lot of slides to go through with that here in a little bit. Again, going back to what I think is one of the most significant and special characteristics of ABLE is the fact that assets in, so money in, and distributions for qualified disability-related expenses will be disregarded or given special treatment when determining eligibility for most federal means-tested benefits, including Social Security and Medicaid. And the reason we use the most instead of all is because there is one exception, and we went over that on the last webinar, but just really quickly, it's for those folks who have ABLE accounts who also are receiving SSI. Only the first $100,000 in the account will be excluded. Once that $100,000 mark is breached, then the person's SSI cash payment will be suspended until such time as the account falls back below that $100,000. But that's the only benefit that's touched. Even if that happens, the person's Medicaid is still intact and everything else, it's just that thing. And it's worth noting that there's going to be plenty of ABLE account owners who are not receiving SSI. So if that's the case, you don't have to worry about that at all. Multiple individuals may contribute into an individual's ABLE account. That means anybody. That means your friends, your family, your employer, yourself. If you're the designated beneficiary, the person with a disability, maybe as a result of either inheritance or employment, you can contribute into your own ABLE account as well. But it's important to note, oh, and I need to update this slide, that anybody can contribute into your ABLE account. However, all contributions combined in any given tax year are not to exceed, and I'm sorry that says $14,000, we'll fix that, it's actually $15,000. So in general, an ABLE account, you can only deposit up to $15,000 a year in an ABLE account. And then the next tax year, the next year, you can contribute an additional, in general, $15,000, and it grows and grows and grows. So one of the questions I often get is, okay, Chris, well, let's say that I put $15,000 in, but then I went and did a home modification, and that would be considered a qualified disability-related expense, and it cost me $5,000. Can I then put an extra $5,000 into my ABLE account during that tax year? The answer is unfortunately no. It doesn't matter how many disbursements you make in any given year, you're still only allowed to contribute, all contributors combined, $15,000 in general. Right? Okay. So let's keep moving. Okay. So we kind of, we talked a little bit about the campaign and the center, but we talked about some general aspects, some general things related to ABLE. And it's also important to note that those things that we just talked about, those are going to be consistent across all ABLE programs. So the things that I just talked about, they're going to be the same no matter if you're enrolled in the Virginia ABLE program, the Ohio ABLE program, the Oregon program, the Texas program, what have you. Those are things that are founded in the federal law that govern every single ABLE program, right? And next week we'll talk a little bit about the things that differ from one program to another, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's talk about what exactly the funds can be spent on. In general, they're called Qualified Disability Expenses, or QDEs, but oftentimes we scratch our heads wondering, well, what in the world does that include? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so what may funds from an ABLE account be used for, right? Well, distributions or money taken out of an ABLE account are required to be used for, quote, qualified disability expenses. Qualified disability expenses are expenses that relate to the designated beneficiary's blindness or disability and are for the benefit of that designated beneficiary in maintaining or improving his or her health, independence, or quality of life, right? So that is an extremely broad definition, and we wanted to make sure that it was allowed to be extremely broad because we appreciate the vastness and the diversity of people with disabilities' needs and how those needs oftentimes can put financial strain on people with disabilities and their families. So we wanted to create a tool and where money could go in and be saved without losing benefits and be able to be spent on whatever needs that particular person with a disability has as a result of living a life with a disability. So, in addition to that definition, Congress gave us some what I like to call buckets, or different categories under which these expenses might fall, right? So they're the things you see on your screen that are bolded, but we also wanted to provide under each of these examples. This by no means is an exhaustive list whatsoever. It's just examples of what might be included under these, quote, buckets, or buckets that I like to call categories of expenses. So let's go through them really quickly. So Congress has said education. That might include tuition, books, tutoring, meal plans. Housing could include rent, mortgage, property taxes, HOA dues. Transportation could include car payments, bus, taxis, Ubers, Lyft fares, trains, airplane fares. Employment, training, and support. This is a big one. That could include job coaching, continuing education classes, and so forth. Assistive technology and personal support services. This is another big one. That could include dictation application, an iPhone, a cook, a house cleaner, support of that nature that could help a person with a disability. Health prevention and wellness. This could be unreimbursable medical expenses, dietary supplements, healthcare products, financial management and administrative services, tax preparation, financial advisors, legal guardianship expenses. Legal fees, that could include attorney's fees, court filing fees, trust and estate planning fees. Expenses for oversight and monitoring, that can again go back to financial management software, things like that. And it even includes basic living expenses, which are defined by Social Security as things like food, housing, clothing, household supplies. And it even also covers funeral and burial expenses. Often people wonder, like, why is that in there? Well, you know, under Social Security rules and under different rules related to being eligible for these programs, funds put away for that can be taken into consideration as assets and can boot people off of certain benefits that they need. So, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a list. The things you see in bold were provided by Congress, and then the things that you see next to them are just examples of what we feel might be under those. But it really is seen through the lens of the person with a disability, and we're going to give some examples later on in the presentation about what those specifically might look like. Again, as I said previously, the IRS's interpretation of qualified disability expenses is extremely broad. We did that, or they did that. We encouraged them to do that purposely because we wanted them to appreciate the vast needs of people with disabilities, and we wanted to make sure that the funds that were being saved in an ABLE account could be used to address the incredibly diverse set of needs of people with disabilities, especially those that meet the eligibility criteria that would allow them to enroll in an ABLE program. Some of the things that I do want to mention in addition to the definition that go a little further and really push on helping people understand just exactly how broad this definition is the fact that there is no, quote, medical necessity for spending these funds. So it's not like Medicaid dollars wherein you have to go to a doctor and the doctor has to write a prescription for a shower chair or this or that, and then you get to go spend the money on it. It's not like that at all. You have much greater access to the money, and you have much greater authority over what that money is spent on. Additionally, you can spend the qualified disability expenses are not necessarily required to have sole benefit to the beneficiary. And this gets a little tricky, so let me give some examples here. So they're supposed to be for the primary benefit of the person with a disability. That's what the law says. That's what these funds are supposed to be used for. But it does not exclude expenses that could have perhaps peripheral benefits to others. So as an example, let's think. So a person could save up money in their ABLE account to purchase an accessible van because they perhaps are in a wheelchair, right? And now they've bought that van, they've used ABLE dollars for it. Does that mean that nobody else can ever take a ride in that van? Of course not. You can have passengers other than the person themselves in that van, but it has to be for the primary benefit of that particular person. So that's kind of one way to think about it. It has to be for the primary, but it does not exclude expenses that could have a peripheral benefit to others that are around the person with a disability. So it's important to note. Also extremely important, despite the fact that this is qualified disability-related expenses are defined incredibly broadly, it is important to note that funds used for qualified disability expenses are not included in taxable income, right? But the opposite is also true. Funds used that are not qualified disability expenses will be included in taxable income and have other types of consequences and penalties that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But again, I wanted to highlight because I know that, and we all know that employment is such an important part of a lot of the advocacy that so many organizations do and so many folks do to try and get people with disabilities to participate in a more significant way in the employment sphere, that ABLE funds can be used for employment-related expenses. So in addition to other disability-related expenses, funds in an ABLE account can be used for employment-related expenses to help ABLE account owners secure and maintain employment. And we give just a few examples of what that might include. And in fact, we did an entire report and paper on employment in ABLE, and you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen there the link to that. We've also done a webinar just on how an ABLE account can be used to help people with disabilities have more beneficial employment outcomes. So I did want to highlight that. Okay. Next slide. So, Medicaid funded services, because this is another important aspect to understand in terms of just the way ABLE dollars are interpreted and can be used, right? So the ABLE Act is designed to supplement rather than supplant benefits and services provided from other sources. Therefore, it can cover gaps in services and supports, and for some people, enable them to maintain Medicaid coverage while possibly saving up for future expenses. And this is what I touched on previously, using Medicaid as an example, and that's important to note. So, you know, it's important to understand and to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. Nobody should ever come to you and say, hey, listen, you have $40,000 in your ABLE account, and therefore you're not eligible for Medicaid. They can't say that because the law states that funds in an ABLE account are meant to supplement, not supplant benefits. Additionally, not only can you not be denied eligibility for these programs as a result of the funds in an ABLE account, you cannot be denied the scope of the services provided in there. So additionally, they can't say, okay, well, we're not going to take those ABLE funds into consideration. However, you know, you would otherwise be receiving, let's say, 30 hours of this type of support, but because you have $50,000 in that account, we're only going to give you 15 hours. That is not allowable either. But as we know, in many of these different programs that offer vital supports and services to people with disabilities, sometimes it's not enough, and it's incredible to have the opportunity to have these funds in an ABLE account that can supplement benefits already being provided through some of these federally funded benefits like Medicaid. Additionally, we want to point out that Medicaid pays for many disability-related supports and services, including supported employment services. CMS, or the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, also oversees the Medicaid buy-in programs, which are designed to support people who are working so that they can retain the support services they need from Medicaid, but are oftentimes, they basically have a premium or a dollar amount you buy into the Medicaid program. You could use ABLE funds to pay for that premium so that you can make a little bit more money while at the same time maintaining your eligibility for Medicaid, which supports so many vital supports and services. So just a couple of examples of, again, the different ways that you can use those funds. Housing expenses, this is another really, really big one. So funds in an ABLE account can be used for housing expenses, including rent. Funds used for housing expenses will not affect the beneficiary's SSI or be seen as in-kind support and maintenance, or as some of you might know it, in-kind support and maintenance, so long as the funds are dispersed from the account in the same month in which the housing expense is paid. So that's kind of a technicality that you need to understand, because oftentimes if you are receiving SSI, that SSI is supposed to be used for basic living expenses, including housing, right? So the idea is, well, if you have other help for that, then we're not going to give you as much as that cash benefit that you might be allowed. You can use ABLE funds for that, provided that you pay your rent or your housing expense in the same month that you pull the money out of the ABLE account. So as long as you're doing that, that's fine. This is another big differentiating factor between an ABLE account and a third-party special needs trust, which cannot be used for things like housing expenses without having an effect on the person's cash benefit provided through SSI. So another great benefit about ABLE accounts. So we talked a little bit about what the funds can be used for, and we'll get into greater detail with that towards the end. But let's talk a little bit about accessing those funds. How do you get a hold of the funds that have been contributed into your ABLE account? So, spending ABLE funds. The ABLE account owner does not need authorization, pre-approval, or any kind of permission to spend funds in their ABLE account. So again, this allows the beneficiary much greater autonomy than perhaps they've ever had before in terms of using these funds. It's not like a third-party special needs trust. It's not like a pooled trust wherein you have to ask permission, you have to be approved to receive funds and things like that. It's much, you have a much greater level of independence in terms of accessing the funds and spending the funds. Additionally, different ABLE programs offer various ways to access the funds in your account, including prepaid debit cards, prepaid cards, and debit cards. And we're going to touch on this more in next week's webinar when we start to talk about how to differentiate one program from another in terms of which one of those offers tools within their program that best meets your particular needs. But it is important to note that many of these programs have created nearly seamless access to the funds for the beneficiary, so that perhaps if you're a person with disability that is going to be using these the funds in your ABLE account on a regular basis, you obviously would want more readily available funds, whereas perhaps you're a parent and you have a child with a disability and you don't plan on touching the funds for years, perhaps accessing the funds through having a debit card or a prepaid card aren't as important to you. So, but anyways, we'll talk about that more next week. Again, we touched on this, but I think it's something that deserves to be stated again. Spending ABLE funds on non-qualified expenses will result in tax penalties and consequences and may affect the beneficiary's eligibility for federally funded benefits. So again, while the definition of what these funds can be spent on is extremely broad, it's important that if they're spent outside the confines of the law or how they're supposed to be spent, not only will there be tax penalties and consequences, but perhaps more importantly, the individual could put into great jeopardy their eligibility for benefits provided through programs such as SSI and Medicaid. So it's important to understand exactly what these funds can be used for, and it's important to understand what would happen if the funds are misused. As we were talking about, misuse of ABLE funds. What happens if ABLE funds are misused? So number one, hypothetically, If a person was able to have more than one ABLE account, which you are not allowed to have more than one ABLE account, you're only allowed one ABLE account per beneficiary. So if I open up an ABLE account in Virginia, I can't then go and open up another ABLE account in Ohio. That's not allowed. You can only have one. Each qualified individual, again, can only have one ABLE account. If an individual has more than one ABLE account for a period of 60 days, then they are subject to a 10% penalty and income taxation on the funds and may affect their eligibility for federal means-tested benefits. And we have in there may affect, but will likely affect the eligibility for those benefits, because only one of those accounts will actually have the protection that is afforded to an ABLE account. And then again, a non-qualified expense. If an expense is deemed during an IRS audit to be not qualified, then these funds are subject to a 10% penalty and taxation, and again will likely affect the eligibility for federally means-tested benefits. So it's again important to understand the penalties and consequences of misusing these funds, and not only with respect to potential tax consequences, but perhaps more importantly, the consequences related to the individual's eligibility for vital supports and services. Okay. All right. Gone through a lot. We're getting there. We're about to get to our examples, but there are also responsibilities of ABLE account owners with respect to the spending of the funds, and we call those record-keeping responsibilities. So let's talk about those a little bit, right? So ultimately, the IRS is the entity responsible for ensuring that ABLE accounts are being used appropriately and within the confines of the law. And we suspect that will be done through the process of random audits. So as a result, we recommend that ABLE account owners keep track of their receipts for all purchases in which they use ABLE funds. And additionally, and it doesn't have to be an exhaustive explanation, but we do recommend that you jot down just a couple sentences on how that particular expense meets the definition. So basically, how does that expense help the beneficiary maintain or increase their health, independence, or quality of life, and how is it related to their disability? So that's kind of a recommendation. We think that would be a smart thing to do in the event or in anticipation of ever getting audited, which you may never get audited, but you never know. We suspect this will be one of the things, if you are audited, the IRS will want to see. So that's just a little advice that we provide to folks in terms of how record keeping could save significant headaches down the road if ever audited. Okay. Wow, that was a lot of information, right? So let's try and take some examples here to kind of flesh out some of the lessons that we've learned over the last few slides. So let me introduce you to my brother, TJ. This is TJ here. He's my bigger brother. He's my older brother. It's just him and I. We grew up outside of Houston together, and he still lives outside of Houston. I'm in D.C. here. But and he's an ABLE account owner. So TJ is the beneficiary. And I believe it's every fall, because it's too hot to go horseback riding for him in the summertime and spring down in Texas, he does therapeutic horseback riding, or technical names hippotherapy, which isn't necessarily uncommon for people with disabilities, but that is often not covered through Medicaid, right? It can be seen as, arguably unconventional type of therapy. And it can have its cost per lesson, per ride, per therapy session. So TJ saves up money in his ABLE account throughout the year, and I can put money into it. My parents can put money into it. Perhaps my grandparents during his birthday can put money. His friends that he has and what have you can put money in there. And when it comes time, when the fall comes, it cools down a little bit, he can go and take advantage of this therapeutic horseback riding. Now, is it a QDE? Is this horseback riding a qualified disability expense? Well, as a result of my brother TJ's disability, he has issues related to his mobility. He has problems with his walking. And we have found, my parents and I, have found that utilizing therapeutic horseback riding assists in strengthening his core and helps ultimately helps his ability to walk by improving his posture, right? This just naturally happens when you're balancing yourself on a horse, and my brother doesn't have the capability to exercise in a more conventional manner that perhaps other people would in a gym, so this actually helps him do that. So horseback riding helps him improve his core, which helps him walk, which I could easily argue increases all his health, his independence, and his quality of life. That's that. It's so we save the receipt, and we jot down just that little explanation there, and we keep records of it. So if ever my brother is audited by the IRS, and Mr. IRS comes along and who has no experience with people with disabilities, because that's not a requirement of being an IRS agent, and is wondering why in the world is TJ spending these ABLE funds on playing around on a horse, right? Because he doesn't know the therapeutic nature of hippotherapy and things like that, and then he reads the explanation. Oh, okay. TJ has problems with walking as a result of strengthening his core, which he does on the horse. It helps his mobility, which helps his health, independence. Oh, okay, well that makes sense. All right, moving on. So it's just an example, a real-life example of a QDE that to a person who's not familiar with people with disabilities might not necessarily recognize, and then an example of how I would record this expense so that if ever audited, I think it should, in my opinion, be satisfactory to the auditor. So there's that one. Some other examples. So these are all hypothetical. The last one was a real deal one, but let's talk a little bit. So this is a profile that we came up with of Troy. Troy is a 4-year-old child with Down syndrome, and his parents have opened an ABLE account for Troy on his behalf. As a military family, Troy will have TRICARE health benefits for his entire life, but he is unable to get on a state's Medicaid waiting list because his family moves around too frequently. Troy's parents are saving money in his ABLE account for his transition to adulthood. They contemplate the money to be, they suspect the money will be used for things like post-secondary education, transportation, any type of assistive technology Troy might need, employment training and supports that perhaps are not being provided through other support systems, independent living supports, and for his basic living expenses. So those all sound fairly legitimate. Let's talk about Jack a little bit. Jack is an autistic adult with an ABLE account. He plans to use the funds in his ABLE account for, number one, a job coach to help him at his workplace, so employment, an iPhone to help him with time management, directions, and text-to-speech software, assistive technology, speech therapy sessions not covered by Medicaid or private insurance, health and wellness, and horseback riding lessons which relax him, health and wellness, and an accountant to help him file his taxes and manage his money, financial management. So these are all examples of different, what I would consider to be, could be disability-related expenses that would help Jack improve his health, independence, or quality of life that somebody might be able to use their ABLE funds for. So this all makes sense. And in addition, these are all things that perhaps could, are added expenses that Jack lives with as a result of his disability, and is the exact reason why ABLE accounts were created to help offset some of those expenses, right? Okay. Sophia, let's meet Sophia, right? Sophia is a college student with cerebral palsy who owns an ABLE account. She uses the ABLE funds to pay for, 1, college tuition, books, a new laptop, computer, and rent for her dorm room, so that's under education, a Lyft, Uber, or taxi to get to school, transportation, housekeeping and cooking at home, personal support services, and furniture for her dorm, basic living expenses. So these are all things that presumably Sophia could use her ABLE funds for, and these help her. Not only are they under the categories that were provided by Congress, but they help her live and increase or maintain her health, her independence, and or her quality of life. All right, let's meet Juan. Juan is an adult with severe mental illness. His parents are his legal guardians and he has recently developed terminal cancer. His parents can use his ABLE account to pay for the following: doctor visit copays, prescriptions, health insurance premiums, that would be under health and wellness, transportation to get Juan to his chemo appointments, transportation, health and wellness, an attorney to review documents pertaining to his estate, legal expenses, and in the unfortunate circumstance that Juan passes away as a result of his cancer, the funds in his ABLE account could be used for his funeral and burial expenses. That's kind of a dark example, but we put these examples together to portray just the incredible diversity and array of different things that you can use your ABLE funds for, including funeral and burial expenses, right? So let's move on. Okay. Wow, that was a lot of information on a very specific topic, but an incredibly important one, right? We need to understand what these funds can be used for in order to appreciate how incredibly special these ABLE accounts are. And again, I don't need to restate what the ABLE National Resource Center is. I know that we discussed it previously. Again, I encourage you to go to the website where you can submit questions. You can get more information about this topic and so many others related to ABLE. There's short videos, there's our webinars, there's testimonials, there's characteristics on each and every ABLE program and links to their particular websites, and so much more. So with that, let's see here, we have about 8-10 minutes. We typically have a group of guest panelists, but I know we've had that the last couple and haven't had a lot of time to answer any questions. So I did want to make sure that we had that opportunity. So let's go through some of the questions that I've seen. What is an NPRM? That's a great question. You might see that from time to time. That just stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which is basically the guidance that a federal agency gives out to help people better understand what that law does. Let's see. Reading through some of the questions, trying to find some themes here. How is the money loaded on the card? So this is specific. Not every ABLE program will have a card associated with their program. So again, we'll talk about this a little more in greater detail next week when we talk about the differences between one program versus another. Some have reloadable cards, some have debit cards. Debit cards are directly linked with the funds in the account, and the reloadable cards you basically request from that ABLE program to dispense $500 onto the card, and then you can go spend those on supports and services that are obviously under the definition of qualified disability-related expenses. Can you give an example of a non-qualified expense? Seems like you can use ABLE for anything and everything. So that's a great question. So really, it has to be seen through the lens. In most circumstances, it has to be seen through the lens of the person with a disability, right? But there are certain things that just cannot be. So one of the things within that definition is the fact that the expense has to be for the benefit of the person with the ABLE account owner, right? So as an example, again, going back to my brother has an ABLE account, and he's got plenty of friends and things like that. He couldn't take money from his ABLE account and go buy his buddy a bicycle, because that is no benefit to him. It has to be for his benefit. So if he has a buddy, it's his birthday, and he wants to go buy his buddy a birthday present, he probably cannot use his ABLE funds to do that. If he pulled out an amount of money for a gift for his friend or anybody else for that matter, it would not be a qualified expense. In addition, so as an example of it being seen through the lens of the beneficiary themselves, we'll go back to my brother again. Basic living expenses include food, right? But it has to be related to the person's disability, at least to a certain extent. So my brother, in addition to having other challenges related to his disability, his dietary issues, of which require him to be on a gluten-free diet. And as many folks know, being on a gluten-free diet can be more costly from a financial perspective because there's certain foods that you can have and certain foods that you can't. So I would argue that as a result of my brother's disability and his requirement to eat gluten-free, be on a gluten-free diet, he can use his ABLE dollars to pay for his food, right? Provided it's gluten-free, blah, blah, blah. Now, does that mean that, let's say I am a person who got into an accident and no longer has the use of my legs, and as a result I qualify for an ABLE account and all that stuff, can I then go purchase food with my ABLE dollars? Well, that might be another circumstance. That person, food might not be a qualified disability expense, wherein food might be a qualified disability expense for a different person based on their circumstances and based on their needs specific to their different types of disabilities. So that's an example of, one, how something can altogether not be qualified because it doesn't have a benefit to the person with the disability, and two, how the same expense could be qualified for one person and not qualified for another person based on their individual needs in line with their individual disabilities. So I hope that makes sense there. Does travel include out-of-state visiting family members and any travel outside the country? Right. So again, I don't think traveling in or outside the country or in interstate or what have you is really the question. The question is, does that travel help that person exercise their independence, and is it a result of their disability? All right, so going back again to my brother, everybody's learning a lot about him today. He gets a lot of supports and services through the Arc of Greater Houston, of which one of them is he goes on trips with them from time to time. He's been to Florida, he's been to California. Actually, he hasn't been to California. He's been to Florida, he lives in Houston, he's been to San Antonio, Galveston, I think. Now, he needs assistance on these trips because of his disability, and he needs support and things like that, and it costs money to go on these trips, so I would argue he can use the funds in his ABLE account to go on these little vacations. Now, how is that possible? Well, I would argue that it has to help his health, independence, and or quality of life. I think getting away from my parents who he lives with helps his quality of life a little bit because he's an adult in his mid to late 30s. But more, I think importantly to that, it teaches him how to be more independent, which is something that he needs to learn how to do because, unfortunately, as we all know, my parents aren't going to be there forever, and he needs to be able to exercise independence, and these trips give him that opportunity, and the funds in the ABLE account pay for the trips and pay for his supports on these trips. So I would argue that those vacations he can use his ABLE funds on, and I would write it up and keep the receipt or whatever the expense is and write up just basically what I told everybody on this call right now, and that would be my explanation on why I think it is in fact a qualified disability-related expense. So it's not really about out-of-state or in-state or across the country, what have you. It's more about whether or not it meets that definition. Let's see here. So where can you keep money if you want to make a non-qualified disability purchase? Where can you keep the money? So I don't know that I completely understand the question, but you can make a non-qualified disbursement. You're just going to have to be aware. I mean, you could put it in your checking account, I guess, or you could put it underneath your mattress. But that's not a qualified disability-related expense, and you'll have to report that as a non-qualified expense, and you will be subject to tax consequences. And even more important to note, those funds that you just took out might be counted as income in that month and could prohibit your eligibility for things like Medicaid and such. Question, what does housing expenses in the same month mean? Great question. So again, in order to allow a person to spend money on things like rent and housing and not affect their cash SSI payment, all that means is my rent is due on September 3rd. I need to take the money out of the account September 1st, 2nd, or 3rd and pay it to my rent in the same month. So I pull it out in September, I pay my rent in September. You can't pull it out in August and then use it to pay for your housing in September. That's basically what it's a technicality, but it's an important one to note. Okay, so I know I didn't get to every question. I hope I got to some of them, and I hope that folks got plenty out of the webinar. I know we had a lot of information. I know we went through it quickly, but all this is archived, will be archived on the web site. We try and get the recording up within a week of the original presentation. What you see on your screen right now is our webinar for next week. I'm really excited about this one. We're going to be unveiling a whole new set of tools for current ABLE account owners, in addition to explaining how to compare one ABLE program to another and what it looks like to enroll. You can go to the website here starting probably tomorrow, to get information on how to register for this webinar. It'll be under our webinar section. That'll be up later this afternoon. Again, my name is Chris Rodriguez, Director of the ABLE National Resource Center. Right there is the ABLE address, the center's address for submitting questions. Please feel free to use that. And thank you, everybody who took an hour out of their day to join us and learn a little bit more about ABLE. And hopefully we will see you all again, same time, same day, next week. All right, thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.